The heavy oak doors swung open, and I stepped inside. The sheer volume of sound hit me first, a cacophony of voices, the clinking of what I assumed were very expensive glasses, and an undercurrent of music that barely registered. It was a lot. I'd expected grandeur, of course, but the sheer noise of it all was almost overwhelming. I took a deep breath, the scent of a floral perfume I couldn't quite place filling my nostrils, and tried to get my bearings. My hand instinctively went to the small, worn leather purse I carried. It felt familiar, a comforting weight against the smooth fabric of my dress. A simple, navy blue thing, really. Comfortable, practical. Definitely not the kind of thing that seemed to be dangling from the wrists of the women around me. Their bags looked like tiny, jeweled sculptures. I glanced around, taking in the scene. Crystal chandeliers, the size of small cars, hung from the impossibly high ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow on everything. The marble floor reflected the light, making the whole room sparkle. And the people, they were a sea of shimmering fabrics, glittering jewelry, and perfectly sculpted hair. I felt a little like I'd stepped into a movie. A waiter, impeccably dressed in a crisp white uniform, glided past me, carrying a silver tray laden with champagne flutes. I politely declined with a small smile as he offered one. I wasn't really in the mood for champagne. Or, more accurately, I wasn't sure I was in the mood to navigate this crowd with a glass in my hand. My eyes scanned the room, trying to find something, anything, to focus on. A painting caught my attention, a vibrant, abstract piece with bold strokes of color. I made my way towards it, hoping to find a moment of quiet contemplation. It was better than trying to decipher the conversations swirling around me, filled with names I didn't recognize and references to places I'd only ever read about. I could feel a few pairs of eyes on me as I moved. Nothing overt, but a subtle awareness of being different. A few curious glances, a quick once-over, and then they'd turn back to their own conversations. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the art, but the feeling lingered. It was like being an extra in a play where everyone else knew their lines, and I was just trying not to bump into the furniture. I reached the painting and stood before it, tilting my head slightly as I tried to absorb the artist's intention. The colors, the texture, the way the light played on the canvas. It was captivating. For a moment, I forgot about the noise, the glittering crowd, the subtle feeling of being out of place. I was lost in the art. I was still absorbed in the painting when a group approached. Their voices, a little louder than the general hum of the room, cut through my concentration. I turned slightly, and there they were. There were 3 of them, 2 women and a man. The woman in the center seemed to be the leader, I suppose. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, the kind that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she had an air of confidence that bordered on, well, something else. The other woman and the man seemed to hang on her every word, their expressions mirroring hers. As they got closer, the leader's gaze swept over me, and I could feel it. It wasn't a curious glance, not really. It was more like an assessment, a quick, dismissive evaluation. I straightened my back a little, trying to project a calm I wasn't entirely sure I felt. "Are you with the catering staff?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. It wasn't a question, not really. It was more of a statement disguised as one. The tone was condescending, like she already knew the answer and was just waiting for me to confirm her assumption. The other woman giggled softly and the man smirked. I could feel my cheeks warming slightly, but I forced myself to meet her gaze directly. "No," I replied, my voice as steady as I could manage. "I'm a guest." It was a simple answer, but it seemed to throw her off balance for a moment. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched slightly, as if surprised that I dared to speak back. "Oh," she said, the word dripping with a kind of amused disbelief. "Well, I don't believe I've seen you here before." "It's a large event," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Indeed," she replied, her eyes still scanning my outfit, my hands, my shoes. It was like I was a specimen under a microscope. "Perhaps you got lost, dear? The catering entrance is around back." The other 2 laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound that echoed in the space between us. I could feel the heat rising in my face now, but I refused to let them see how much their words were affecting me. "I'm quite sure I'm in the right place," I said, my voice still calm, though I could feel a slight edge to it. I turned back towards the painting, hoping they would take the hint and leave me alone. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I was facing the painting. The murmur of their voices, hushed but still audible, drifted behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know what they were saying. Snippets of words reached me. "That outfit, who does she think she is?" followed by that brittle, unpleasant laughter again. It was a strange sensation being the object of their amusement. It wasn't the first time I'd encountered this kind of dismissal, but it still stung. There was a particular sting in being judged, not for anything I'd said or done, but simply for the way I looked, for not conforming to their idea of what someone at this event should be. I took a deep breath, trying to focus on the artwork in front of me. The artist's use of color was truly remarkable, the way the light seemed to dance on the canvas. It was a world away from the petty whispers behind me. I tried to immerse myself in it, to let the vibrant hues and intricate details fill my mind, pushing out the sound of their voices. But it was hard. The laughter, though quiet, seemed to echo in the vast space, bouncing off the polished marble and the crystal chandeliers. It was a constant reminder of their presence, their judgment. It was like a small, persistent pebble in my shoe, irritating and impossible to ignore completely. I shifted my weight slightly, trying to appear completely absorbed in the painting. I studied the brushstrokes, the texture of the paint, the subtle variations in tone, anything to keep my mind occupied, to prevent it from dwelling on their words. It was a strange feeling, this duality. On the one hand, I was genuinely captivated by the art. The passion and skill of the artist were undeniable. On the other hand, I was acutely aware of the whispers, the laughter, the feeling of being an outsider in this glittering world. It was like trying to appreciate a beautiful piece of music while someone was constantly playing a discordant note nearby. I could feel my shoulders tensing slightly, and I consciously relaxed them. I refused to let them see how much their words were affecting me. I would not give them the satisfaction. I would continue to appreciate the art, to engage with the event in my own way, regardless of their superficial judgments. The murmur of voices continued, a constant backdrop to the evening. I moved away from the painting, deciding to explore a different section of the room. I found myself drawn to a display of sculptures, intricate and thought-provoking pieces that seemed to pulse with a quiet energy. As I stood there, admiring the delicate curves and the bold angles of one particular sculpture, I felt a different kind of attention. Not the dismissive, judgmental glances I'd encountered earlier, but something softer. I turned slightly and saw an older gentleman standing a few feet away. He wasn't part of the group that had mocked me. He had silver hair, a kind face, and his eyes held a warmth that was a welcome contrast to the coolness I'd experienced so far. He offered a small, polite smile, a subtle nod of acknowledgement. It was a simple gesture, but it felt significant. It was as if he was saying, "I see you. I see that you're here for something more than just the spectacle." I returned the smile, a genuine one this time. It was a relief to connect with someone who didn't seem to be caught up in the social posturing and superficiality of the event. He approached me, his steps unhurried and steady. "That's quite a piece, isn't it?" he said, his voice gentle and thoughtful. "It is," I replied, my voice a little softer than I'd intended. "The way the artist has captured the tension between the smooth curves and the sharp edges, it's really remarkable." "Indeed," he agreed. "It speaks to the duality of existence, I think, the constant push and pull between opposing forces." We talked for a few moments, about the sculpture, about the artist, about art in general. It was a conversation that flowed easily, unburdened by the need to impress or to prove anything. It was simply two people sharing a genuine appreciation for something beautiful. I learned that he was a curator, that he had a deep knowledge of art and a quiet passion for it. He didn't ask me about my social standing or my attire. He seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and my perspective. It was a brief encounter, but it was a welcome respite from the earlier interactions. It was a reminder that not everyone at this event was defined by their wealth or their social status. There were still people who valued genuine connection and shared interests. The event, as I was starting to understand, was a charity auction. Large screens displayed the items up for bid, each one more extravagant than the last. I found myself drawn to a display of sculptures, intricate and thought-provoking pieces that seemed to pulse with a quiet energy. As I stood there admiring the delicate curves and the bold angles of one particular sculpture, I felt a different kind of attention. Not the dismissive, judgmental glances I'd encountered earlier, but something softer. I turned slightly and saw an older gentleman standing a few feet away. He wasn't part of the group that had mocked me. He had silver hair, a kind face, and his eyes held a warmth that was a welcome contrast to the coolness I'd experienced so far. He offered a small, polite smile, a subtle nod of acknowledgement. It was a simple gesture, but it felt significant. It was as if he was saying, "I see you. I see that you're here for something more than just the spectacle." I returned the smile, a genuine one this time. It was a relief to connect with someone who didn't seem to be caught up in the social posturing and superficiality of the event. He approached me, his steps unhurried and steady. "That's quite a piece, isn't it?" he said, his voice gentle and thoughtful. "It is," I replied, my voice a little softer than I'd intended. "The way the artist has captured the tension between the smooth curves and the sharp edges, it's really remarkable." "Indeed," he agreed. "It speaks to the duality of existence, I think. The constant push and pull between opposing forces." We talked for a few moments about the sculpture, about the artist, about art in general. It was a conversation that flowed easily, unburdened by the need to impress or to prove anything. It was simply two people sharing a genuine appreciation for something beautiful. I learned that he was a curator, that he had a deep knowledge of art and a quiet passion for it. He didn't ask me about my social standing or my attire. He seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and my perspective. It was a brief encounter, but it was a welcome respite from the earlier interactions. It was a reminder that not everyone at this event was defined by their wealth or their social status. There were still people who valued genuine connection and shared interests. The event, as I was starting to understand, was a charity auction. Large screens displayed the items up for bid, each one more extravagant than the last. I found myself drawn to a collection of contemporary paintings, their bold colors and abstract forms speaking to me in a way the more traditional pieces didn't. I lingered near them, studying the techniques, the brush strokes, the way the artists had used light and shadow. I overheard a fragment of a conversation nearby, the familiar voices of the group who'd approached me earlier. "Such a waste of money," one of them was saying, her tone dismissive. "I mean, anyone could splash paint on a canvas like that." Another voice, the woman who seemed to be the leader, chimed in. "Exactly. Some people are so easily impressed, probably thinks it's cutting edge." She said the words with a slight sneer, the air quotes around cutting edge dripping with sarcasm. I felt a familiar wave of irritation wash over me, but I consciously pushed it aside. Their words, though directed generally, were clearly meant to belittle anyone who might appreciate art that didn't conform to their narrow definition of good taste. I continued to examine the paintings, my interest undeterred. I noticed a subtle use of texture in one piece, a delicate layering of paint that created a sense of depth and movement. I wondered about the artist's process, the emotions they were trying to convey. "It's fascinating, isn't it?" I heard a voice say, and I turned to see the curator from before. He was standing beside me, his eyes also fixed on the painting. "It is," I agreed, my voice sincere. "The way the artist has used impasto here, it's almost sculptural." He nodded, his eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "Exactly. Most people just see the colors, the shapes, but you see the technique, the intention." As we discussed the painting, I felt a sense of connection with him, a shared understanding that transcended the superficiality of the event. We talked about the history of abstract art, the influence of different movements, the challenges of conveying emotion without relying on representational forms. I could feel the weight of the earlier judgment lifting, replaced by the simple pleasure of engaging in a conversation about something I truly cared about. Their dismissive comments faded into the background, becoming just another discordant note in the symphony of the evening. The curator and I continued our discussion, moving from one painting to another. I found myself sharing my thoughts on the artist's techniques, the emotional impact of their work, the subtle nuances that often went unnoticed. I spoke with a passion that surprised even myself, the words flowing easily as I articulated my appreciation for the art. At one point, I mentioned a particular artist, a relatively obscure figure whose work I'd studied extensively. I referenced a specific technique he'd used in a series of paintings from the early 1960s, a technique that was quite innovative for its time. As the words left my mouth, I noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The curator's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on me, as if seeing me in a new light. I could feel the familiar group, the ones who had dismissed me earlier, had fallen silent. I didn't turn to look at them, but I could sense their attention had shifted. Their whispers, which had been a constant hum, had ceased. The curator cleared his throat, his expression thoughtful. "That's a very specific observation," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Most people aren't familiar with his work from that period." I offered a small smile. "I've always been interested in his artistic development. That particular series was quite groundbreaking." For a moment there was a palpable silence. I could feel their eyes on me, those same eyes that had earlier dismissed me as someone who didn't belong. But now there was a different quality to their gaze, a hint of uncertainty, a flicker of confusion. I saw the woman, the leader of the group, exchange a quick glance with her companions. There was a subtle furrow in her brow, a momentary crack in her confident facade. It was as if she was trying to reconcile the image she had formed of me with the knowledge I had just displayed. However, the moment of doubt was fleeting. She quickly regained her composure, her expression hardening slightly. She cleared her throat and changed the subject, directing her attention to a nearby sculpture, her voice a little louder than necessary. "This piece is simply divine," she declared, her tone once again dismissive. "The craftsmanship is unparalleled." It was a clear attempt to reassert her dominance, to steer the conversation back to familiar territory, back to the world of superficiality and social posturing. The atmosphere of the event shifted, a subtle but undeniable change in the air. It was like a current had passed through the room, a collective intake of breath. The murmur of voices, previously a steady hum, seemed to rise and fall in a different rhythm. I glanced around, trying to discern the cause of this sudden shift. At the far end of the hall, near the grand entrance, a new figure had appeared. He was tall, with silver hair and an impeccable suit that spoke of wealth and power. There was an aura of authority about him, a quiet confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. People seemed to part as he moved, their faces turning towards him, their expressions shifting to a mixture of deference and eagerness. I watched as the group that had dismissed me earlier suddenly became animated. The woman, the leader, straightened her posture, smoothed down her dress, and her eyes sparkled with a newfound interest. The man, who had smirked at my expense, now wore a carefully cultivated expression of, well, it was hard to define. Respect, awe, a desire to be noticed. They moved, almost as if drawn by a magnet, towards the approaching figure. Their voices, previously filled with condescension, now took on a different tone, softer, more ingratiating. They seemed desperate to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be included in his orbit. I remained where I was, near the sculptures, observing this subtle but significant change in their demeanor. I didn't recognize the man, didn't know his name or his position, but it was clear he was someone of importance, someone whose presence held sway over this room, filled with wealth and influence. I felt a slight detachment from the scene unfolding before me. Their sudden eagerness to impress, their obvious concern for social standing, only served to highlight the superficiality of their earlier behavior. It was a stark contrast to the genuine connection I had felt with the curator, a connection based on shared interests and mutual respect, not on social hierarchy or the desire for approval. The important man continued to move through the room, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He seemed to be searching for someone, his eyes scanning the faces with a focused intensity. The important man's gaze swept across the room, and for a moment I thought he was looking past me, searching for someone more significant. I turned slightly, ready to continue my exploration of the sculptures, when his eyes locked onto mine. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine warm smile that seemed to light up his entire expression. It wasn't the polite, distant smile one gives to a stranger. It was a smile of recognition, of delight. I felt a flicker of surprise, a sense of confusion. I didn't recognize him, didn't know why he would be smiling at me like that. He started to walk towards me, his steps purposeful and unhurried. The room seemed to fall silent, the conversations fading into a hushed murmur. All eyes were on him, and by extension, on me. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a mixture of curiosity and something else. I couldn't quite place it. As he got closer, I could see the lines around his eyes, the subtle creases that spoke of wisdom and experience. He extended his hand, his grip firm and warm. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying a rich, resonant tone. "Victoria Hayes, the woman herself. My name." He knew my name. I felt a wave of astonishment wash over me. I managed a polite, "Hello," my voice a little breathless. He chuckled, a friendly, genuine sound. "They told me you might be here tonight, but I almost didn't believe it. You're notoriously difficult to catch at these events." He kept his hand on my arm, a friendly gesture that seemed to exclude everyone else in the room. The group that had dismissed me earlier, the woman and her companions, stood frozen a few feet away. Their faces were a study in shock. Their carefully cultivated expressions of superiority had crumbled, replaced by a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. I still couldn't place this man, but his words, his tone, his obvious pleasure at seeing me, it was all completely unexpected. It was as if I had stepped into a different reality, where the rules of this high society world no longer applied. The important man, whose name I later learned was James, kept a friendly hand on my arm, turning slightly to address the room. His voice, accustomed to boardrooms and lecture halls, carried effortlessly, silencing the remaining whispers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone warm and slightly amused. "For those who don't know, you're in the presence of greatness tonight. Victoria Hayes rarely graces these events with her presence." I felt a blush rising to my cheeks. I'd never been comfortable with such pronouncements, such fanfare. I preferred to let my work speak for itself. A man I recognized as the curator, the one I'd been speaking with earlier, stepped forward, his expression a mixture of comprehension and awe. "You're that Victoria Hayes of Hayes Ventures?" I nodded, my smile a little self-deprecating. "The same." He breathed out a sound of genuine wonder. "Good heavens, your acquisition of the Thompson collection last year was masterful. And your donation to the Metropolitan's Restoration Department," James chuckled, a low rumbling sound. "My God, man, everyone in the art world knows Victoria Hayes. Or they should." The room was buzzing now, a low hum of whispers and murmurs. I could hear snippets of conversations. Hayes Ventures, one of the largest private collections, turned down a seat on the MoMA board, donates millions anonymously. The group that had dismissed me earlier, they were still standing there, their faces pale, their carefully constructed facades completely shattered. The woman, the leader, was speechless, her mouth slightly agape. The man who had smirked at my expense was now staring at me with a look of, I couldn't quite define it, a mixture of embarrassment and a dawning realization of his own foolishness, perhaps. James turned his attention back to me, his eyes filled with admiration. "Now, Victoria, I heard you mentioning something about the brushwork on the Hartman painting. You always did have the most discerning eye in the business. The Hartman painting, the centerpiece of the auction, the one they had all been so eager to bid on, the one I had quietly observed, the one I had dared to question. James led me back to the Hartman painting, the crowd parting respectfully as we approached. The museum director, a man who had previously seemed more concerned with the wealthy donors, now hovered near us, his expression eager and slightly flustered. "Miss Hayes," he stammered, his voice filled with a newfound respect, "I had no idea you would be attending tonight. We would have prepared a proper welcome." I offered a small, polite smile. "That's precisely why I come unannounced," I replied, my tone gentle but firm. "I prefer to observe without ceremony." I turned my attention to the painting, pointing to the area that had caught my eye earlier. The technique in this section doesn't align with Hartman's documented approach from this period. I believe it may have been restored, perhaps not entirely faithfully to the original. The director examined the area closely, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "You know, I think you're right. Our authentication team mentioned some restoration, but didn't flag it as significant. It doesn't diminish the piece's value," I added, "but it should be noted in the provenance." James shook his head in admiration. "This is why your collection is unparalleled, Victoria. You see what others miss." The whispers around us had intensified, the socialites who had previously ignored or mocked me now vying for my attention. They were eager to be associated with me, now that my identity was known, their transformation as immediate as it was transparent. I saw the woman, the leader of the group, attempting to approach me, a strained smile on her face. Her social circle, which had previously seemed impenetrable, was now disintegrating as its members peeled away to orbit me instead. As the evening drew to a close, I prepared to leave. The crowd parted once more, their faces that had earlier shown disdain, now beaming with a forced admiration. The curator approached me, his expression both sheepish and amused. "Miss Hayes, thank you for your generosity tonight, and I must apologize for not recognizing you earlier." I shook my head, my gaze drifting across the room to where the woman stood, isolated and uncomfortable. "No apology needed, Mr. Williams. You treated me with respect before you knew my name or net worth. That speaks to your character." I turned to leave, James walking me out, chatting amiably. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. Not because I had been recognized, not because my wealth had been revealed, but because for a brief moment I had been seen for who I truly was, not for what I appeared to be. The lesson I hoped would linger.